Hello, everyone. We are going to now work on our second teach back. Who's the group that had the safe cooler storage? Great. We are still in chapter 5, and as you're moving along, let's hear from our group of some major points that we need to emphasize when we're talking about cooler storage. What are some common challenges, say, that you find in your walk-ins? What are you hearing? Yes, right, overload. Uh, Sometimes that can happen with maybe events coming up that we need to purchase extra, sometimes holidays, right? How do you handle that? Great. Sometimes with purchasing and staggering some of your receiving and ordering, maybe dialing back on some standard items that you have, of course, making sure you have enough stock. That is a great way to allow room for maybe some events or large item volumes that you may have that might clog up your coolers, right? Because what happens with your coolers when they get clogged up? Yeah, they potentially could be unsafe from overload, right? So let's start here and let's join me on 510 and let's look at the beginning of safe cooler storage. We have gotten some great examples of storage challenges to storage solutions. But let's start with labeling. So what labeling does your operation use? Great. So you use a use by date instead of like a today's date. Okay. And that I like that process, right? Because then it's very clear. Nobody has to do the math. They just know what today's date is, and then that has to be used by that date. So I find that use by date, in my opinion, is more clear than doing the count. But having calendars around and having date markings really does help with that. So either way, right? Some people use prep date, so the day that they made it, right? And also, I'm sure you've seen there's lots of systems out there for labeling. You can do as a quick Sharpie on something to, like a cellophane to a blank label that we pull on and off. It's really better to utilize something that can come on and off, just so that you're not kind of using up labels or crossing out, right? We want to use fresh labels for fresh products. But there in our vendors, there are great labeling systems for you tracking that actually already have the day on it and it's lined up for the day, date, and year. It even sometimes is color coded. So some people like to color code their labels. So either way, coming up with what the requirements are, what system you use, and of course, training on that, right? So let's talk about a little bit of the labeling. There are some components in labeling that we need to identify and just to make sure. So all foods should be labeled if they are on site. So if they're in its original packaging, then that packaging and that date on that packaging is adequate. Say like cottage cheese and it has its date on it already. But if an item needs to come out of its original packaging, which a lot of our products do, and then we either store it as is or prep it to store, right? It needs a label. And what should be on that label, right? So depending on your system, so you can either do the use by date or today's date that it was prepared on. But it must say also what it is, right? So you could have salt and sugar and maybe flour, and depending on looking at that product without any labels, you might not quickly be able to determine what it is. So we always want to label instead of assume that everybody knows that that's salt. Who hasn't had an experience or have heard of an experience where somebody grabs something maybe unlabeled, they're in the flow, they scoop it up, boom, there goes a cup of salt instead of a cup of sugar, and voila, we have to restart. So that has happened. Anybody else? Yeah. So labeling is extremely important, um, especially in items that are stored long term. Because if it's a food item that we are actually going to use today, so we're prepping something and we're going to use it today, it is okay to not label it. But that has to be labeled if it's going to be held for longer than 24 hours. And of course, you're going to hold it in time temperature controls. But if you're not going to use that up that day and it goes in that cooler before you leave that shift, be sure to date that. What's the other rule for date marking? We're on page 511 now, right? Date marking is important because we want to know how long ago this item was pulled out, prepared, and then maybe stored again. Whether it was prepared for 2 days later that we're going to use it, or it's prepared and now we're trying to figure out what to do with this leftover. Whatever it may be, we want to make sure that it is discarded at day 7. So there's a great example of that on page 512, if you want to join us, where somebody is using a calendar. So sometimes I've seen in operations the chefs that talk to each other, right? And so they talk to each other through chef notes and through calendars like this, and they put them up in the prep area so that we know, especially in operations, that you can use a chef special. Often chef specials, wink, wink, are you items that we're trying to use up, right? Which is okay. They're safe. They've been monitored. They're safe, but we want to communicate between shifts, between chefs, and not assume that between each other that we know what the other one is thinking or doing or did on their day off, right? Coming back from your day off and then you don't know what's in your cooler, especially if it hasn't been labeled. So make sure that we're using some kind of system to label and date the day it was either prepared or the day that it needs to be thrown out. And then also, what is it? And with that 7-day rule, we do want to highlight that if it is a prepared item that has multiple ingredients, the 7-day rule is actually from the oldest ingredient in that item. So the example, right, would be what? You're making some kind of turkey noodle casserole, right? And everything's fresh except the turkey, right? Because we're trying to use up the turkey. That's why we made that a special today or for tomorrow. So if the turkey was prepped on Tuesday and it is Thursday that we're making this and trying to use it up, that means that we're not labeling and dating it from Thursday. We're actually labeling and dating it use by date from when the turkey was prepared, so that then it's 1 week from that, the following Tuesday, that it must be used up or discarded. Right? So that oldest ingredient is what the date that we're using the timeline for, if that makes sense for you. Good. That's very important. So in our safe storage, not only are we checking those temps, right? And constantly, whether it be in dry storage or cold storage or freezer storage, but we're also making sure that we're labeling with what that item is, when it was prepped, when are we going to throw that out, and of course making sure that during that time frame we're holding it in safe temperature control at 40 degrees or lower, or safe temperature controls in dry storage as well. All right, so let's go to reflecting on temperatures of and storage in the cooler of your food items. So on page 5.15, there is a beautiful example of how we store in our refrigerators and dry storage. So let's look at cold storage first and then we'll go into dry. So with cold storage, it's important to prevent what? Right? Cross contamination. And this often happens when we're not paying attention to where we're putting things in a cooler. So a nice organized cooler. Does anybody label their coolers of where things are supposed to be? This is supposed to be for our meats. This is supposed to be for day use items. These are dairy, right? That's another great, excellent step to be clear of where we are storing items to also help this. But not everybody has the luxury of a real big walk-in cooler like I have in large commercial facility operations. Some of you are working in tight quarters and tight refrigeration. But what we never should compromise on is how we store things above each other. So the example here, you can see what is that and this is the way that I like to remember it too, is that the food items that need to be cooked the highest, right? Our meats, our ground meats, anything with stuffings that are what temp? Right, 165. Think of it as the thing that you have to cook the highest should be on the lowest shelf. And that's because that the items that are on the top, if by any chance they dribble down, which happens through movement, that item below will, if it dripped from above, so 155-degree item, right? Like fish or ground meats and stuff, will then possibly drip down to a whole and ground poultry item, that will be cooked to the temperature and kill whatever was possibly there, right? So it's just kind of like a stopgate that the highest temperature to be cooked should be on the lowest shelf so that the items that are above, if by any chance drips down, that item that it dripped onto will be cooked higher than the temp that it was safe to be cooked to ensure that it's safe. Not that we want to have that happen, but that's kind of the concept, right? And so you can see in that picture how food items are on sheet pans, but they're also in racks so that airflow goes around. And then the short, shallow sheet pans also help with drippings to maintain the pan versus any kind of flat sheets. So keep that in mind. All right. And so the airflow, looking around, is also important. So overstuffing coolers also doesn't circulate the air to get to all the parts. And then also it makes your cooler operate or work harder. And so therefore that potentially runs down your refrigerators, which everybody knows is such a challenge if a refrigerator goes down. And having some kind of plan when a refrigerator coolers and freezers go down, what backup do you have? What action plan? Do you have another cooler that you can easily get? Can you quickly obtain a refrigerated truck to sit outside? Those type of action plans should be in place before you're in operation. And if you don't have that, go back today and you're going to be able to create something like that in the event of. All right. So let's talk about your dry storage, right? So preventing airflow and blockage and the safe storage of foods, we want to make sure that our dry storage has its airflow and items labeled, organized, and dated, right? And so we identified this before. FIFO, which is on your morning quiz, is what? We've said it before, first in, first out. So making sure that your receiver, and when we're storing, we put those items behind and pull the old stuff up first so that we use that first. Even in products that you use all the time, like butters or milks, even like your high volume items, still keep that practice because people have got caught with just thinking, oh, well, I'm just going to pull from the front or I use this all the time. And then an item gets pushed back for one reason or another. And then, you have a challenge there. So, what we're going to do to reinforce this is we've got a great quiz, right? So, on your tables here, we are just going to do a quick check, reminding you of what are the internal temperatures of certain food items. And I can tell you this, I can't tell you exactly what's on the exam, but I can tell you knowing the differences of what temperatures these food items need to be cooked to is extremely important in your safe operation. And to highlight that when something is either injected or ground or stuffed, that usually is an indicator that it goes to a higher temperature. And why would that be? Yeah, there's manipulation that happens there. Or like we said with the reduced oxygen packaging, right? When you inject something, of course, making sure that your thermometer is clean. When you inject something, you could potentially be bringing a additional contaminants in. So that's why I like marinated or injected, anything that's ground stuffed, remember that they're at a higher temp. So go ahead, we're going to pause here and just take a couple minutes and chalk this up and we will review. And you are welcome to verify for yourself from the from your book to help you out because this is information we want you to know. So go ahead and do your cooking test quiz and we will come back and review. Wonderful. All right, before we go to lunch, we're going to ask for any questions from the morning. So we talked about the safe food handling, right? In chapter 1, we started of why it's important to provide safe food. Then we talked about the ever-loving forms of contamination, either physical, chemical, or the biological, which is always the scariest part of this, is that we don't come across it often, but we're handling it often of the different pathogens. And then the safe food handler of our hands are the coolest and they're also the most dangerous. So, safe food handling. And then we talked this morning about the flow of food and we introduced the 9 major components, but then we dove deep, right? We dove deep into the purchasing, receiving, and cooler storage, both cold and dry, to keep our food safe. So, do we have any questions? Great.